Well, today I'm going to keep on going through Matthew's Gospel. And of course, we're in that section 6 I keep describing for you, which here is the description of Jesus' final week in Jerusalem, his final visit, his final week of his earthly ministry, his final visit to Jerusalem, and the week leading up to his crucifixion. And I've titled this, Jesus Pronounces Judgment Against Israel and Its Leaders. And it is very much in that flavor. It's a very confrontational section of Matthew's Gospel. And that's roughly from the very end of chapter 20 all the way through to the very end of chapter 25. And I'm teaching through the last portion of that section, which is a very clear portion in its own right. This is a sermon that Jesus taught to his disciples, just to them in private, which was done on the Mount of Olives just outside of Jerusalem. So we call it the Olivet Discourse, and that is, of course, Matthew 24 and 25. So the very last portion of section 6. And in this portion, Jesus he predicts and describes the destruction of Jerusalem's temple, his second coming, and the end of the age. So it's a very far-reaching portion and pretty heavy in some respect on end-time stuff, but also some other things as well that would have been important for that first generation of Christianity. So it's very much like from the beginning of the church age to the very end, very all-encompassing. Well, as of today, we've made it to a brand new passage that I've not spoken about yet. This is passage number 8 of the Olivet Discourse, if you still have the handout I gave you at the beginning, as I've broken this down into pieces. And this particular passage is the passage where Jesus warns people that no one can know the day or the hour of his return. And he has very recently been speaking about the second coming in the recent passages we've been studying. And now he warns that no one can know when that is going to happen. And that is Matthew 24, verses 36 through 41. And I will read that to you right now. So he says this, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. There will be 2 men in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and the other left." And that's as far as we'll read for today. Starting with my next sermon, I'll begin a very typical exposition of this passage, the normal way that I teach a passage, trying to understand every word, every phrase, how it connects, and its implications for the overall whole of the Olivet Discourse. We will do all of that next time. But for today, I want to do something a bit less conventional, so stepping outside of the normal methods of my preaching, I guess you could say. Today, I would like to review the history of failed predictions for the return of Christ, or failed predictions for the end times generally, which is amazing that there can be a whole sermon dedicated to that, but that is what I have planned for today. Sad to say, Christians have a long history of deceiving and being deceived by predictions made about the end times. It's become sort of a standard thing, especially in very recent centuries, but it has always been present in some measure throughout church history. This practice is often called date setting, because very often the people that do this trying to put a date on things like Jesus will return by this year, or sometimes they're even more precise. They give a month and a day and a year, precisely for when Jesus is going to return, or some other event related to the end times. Amazingly, Christians have tried this kind of date setting more and more often through the centuries. It's been kind of this cascade effect where at first there was a little bit of it, then there was a lot more of it, and then it became just all pervasive to the point where it seems to be a constant feature of Christianity. So more and more as the years have gone by, And we've done this even though we have always had a 0% success rate, which is to say that no one has ever gotten this right in 2,000 years, and yet we keep doing it. We just keep on trying. For my part, I suspect that our constant foolishness and date setting is fueled by a short memory. There are maybe some other factors to talk about, and I will talk about those as we go and at the very end, but I think a short memory is a very red-handed culprit when it comes to what's responsible for this kind of thing. We just forget that we have tried this and failed at it so often. Therefore, I think it wise for Christians to study the long history of failed predictions on this topic for the return of Christ in order to sway us away from falling into that folly again as much as possible. Like the saying of those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. Well, we repeat it a lot, and we need to remember better what has gone before so we don't do this kind of thing again. So today's sermon is called Unprofitable Prophets, not necessarily in the sense that everyone who tries to set a date for the return of Christ is trying to be a prophet in the classical sense, but they are trying to predict the future to some degree, and it never has any value whatsoever. So in that sense, they are unprofitable prophets. My outline today has 5 headings, and these headings follow the 5 phases of history in which date setting seems to have been especially common. So we're going through church history as I go through these headings. So here's the 5. First, the persecution of Emperor Septimius Severus, which is a Roman emperor, if you can't tell by the very illustrious name that he has. That's the first heading. Secondly, the First New Millennium. And by that I mean the time around the year 1000. And then third, the Protestant Reformation, a period perhaps more familiar to most of us. Fourth, what is usually called the Restoration Movement, getting into the 1800s. And then finally, the 5th heading I have, what I have called the present insanity, which is how I characterize the status quo of Christianity today, trying to predict the return of Christ. Now, I have no idea how interesting this sermon might be for the younger crowd here. I certainly hope that none of my sermons are boring to you, but I do hope that on this particular topic, the younger people here will listen very intently, because I pretty much view this sermon as being more for you than for the grown-ups and the big people here, because I know the grown-ups here among us pretty well, and I'm pretty sure that not many of us are especially tempted to go along with anyone trying to set a date for the return of Christ. However, I don't know that for sure for the younger group here. You know, you're definitely young, you've got a lot of living to do, God willing, and you're going to encounter all kinds of things in the future, and some of that is going to be some of these date setters. I guarantee you're going to hear people come to you and say, you know, God has shown us that Christ is going to return by X date or whatever. You're going to hear that kind of stuff. And assuming that Jesus does not delay his return, I mean, you all are probably going to hear that kind of thing, and I want you to be ready for it. I want you to know how to think about these things, and if nothing else, I want you to know that we've tried all this before, and it has never gone well. So I hope that you younger people will begin now to see the foolishness of this kind of date setting, this effort to predict the return of Christ or other things about the end times. And hopefully you'll be able to spend the rest of your life free of that kind of nonsense, because it really is. And you'll hear a lot of nonsense today, but it's all meant to warn you against that kind of thing. So that is what I really hope for this sermon today. And we'll go ahead and get started. We'll go back to that first phase of history that I mentioned, which I called the persecution of Emperor Septimius Severus. And if you're wondering when that was, I will give you a time frame here. So Septimius Severus became the Roman emperor in the year 193. So that's where we are kind of in history. And about 9 years later, in the year 202, he began a deliberate persecution of Jews and Christians. So he was definitely one of the emperors that took it upon himself to just eradicate the religious oddballs from the Roman Empire, and the two major ones are the Jews and the Christians, whenever the Roman emperors got this idea. Previous emperors had instituted deliberate persecution, but Septimius Severus was especially focused and brutal. A lot of Roman emperors would, casually or haphazardly persecute Christians, but some of them went all out, and Septimius Severus was certainly one of those. It was during this persecution that we seem to have the first hard evidence for Christians believing that the end of the age was very near, and also our first reference to date setting. So there in about the year 202, we start to see Christians doing this kind of thing, trying to predict the return of Christ for a time very near to them. Now, the culprit in this was a Christian who unfortunately has the name Judas. Not a very good name for a Christian to have, but this was a Christian man named Judas. He wrote a book or was teaching in some way or other, and we have record of what he was teaching. There's another author that I've mentioned before, Eusebius of Caesarea. He wrote a book called The History of the Church. He talks about this guy Judas and the kinds of things he was teaching. And he writes this. I'm just going to quote from Eusebius here. At this time, another writer, Judas, discoursing about the 70 weeks in Daniel, brings down the chronology to the 10th year of the reign of Emperor Severus. He thought that the coming of Antichrist, which was much talked about, was then near. So greatly did the agitation caused by the persecution of our people at this time disturb the minds of many. End quote. So says Eusebius about the teachings of this man Judas and his efforts to predict things. Now that's the first record we have of anyone trying to set a kind of date for some kind of end times event. Specifically in this case it was the coming of Antichrist, but of course in the usual way of thinking the Antichrist comes and then Christ returns afterward. So we're definitely dealing with end time stuff. But also notice that this particular Judas was not the only Christian who thought the Antichrist was near. Based on what Eusebius describes, he says that the persecution of that time disturbed the minds of many, and a lot of people were talking about the Antichrist, and were very much in this kind of end times expectation at this point in history. So definitely the first time in history where we see this kind of thing. During a wave of persecution, worse than persecutions that had come before, it creates this effort to calculate when the end is going to be, and trying to set a date. And this guy, Judas, he set it for the 10th year of the Roman Emperor, Septimius Severus. Remember that he started his persecution in the 9th year. So basically they thought things were moving pretty quickly at that point, and before long they would see the end of the age and the return of Christ and all that. None of that panned out, but that's what they were saying. And you see it happen during this wave of persecution by this particular Roman emperor. So that's the first example we have in the history of the church for this kind of thing. Now, thankfully, we have a long break between that and the next phase of history where this seems to have been common. And for that, we're going to move ahead in history by about 800 years to what I've called the First New Millennium. And by that I mean the time around the year 1000. So, a little over 1,000 years ago from today. Now, as the year 1000 drew near, Christians began to wonder if it would bring the end of the age. And I don't know, those of us who were alive and aware of things around the year 2000, there was something kind of similar happening then, but that was probably to be expected for other reasons. But back during the year 1000, there was definitely a kind of expectation for the end as that year drew near to people. Now, for the most part, this expectation of the end was brought upon by the millennium passage in the book of Revelation, which I will read to you just briefly. And you don't necessarily have to turn there. We won't be there long. I just want to read the passage that they're talking about. So Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 through 7 says, "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding the key of the abyss and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, a millennium. And he threw him into the abyss, and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he would not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were completed. After these things he must be released for a short time. Then I saw thrones, and they that sat on them, and judgment was given to them. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony of Jesus, and because of the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or his image, and had not received the mark on their forehead or on their hand. And they came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who has a part in the first resurrection. Over these the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and will reign with him for 1,000 years. When the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison. Now, it's not the time to talk about that passage because there's all kinds of complications coming in with that passage, but we can say this: some Christians understood that to mean that the age would end at 1,000 years after Christ. That was a very prevalent way to read the passage back in that time that we're talking about. Furthermore, some Christians reckoned those 1,000 years from the birth of Christ. Others of them reckoned that time from the ascension of Christ to heaven. So there's kind of a 30-plus year kind of leeway there for actually nailing down the end of those 1,000 years. But for the most part, a lot of Christians back then took that 1,000-year mark to mean, roughly around the year 1,000, right? And as the year 1,000 drew near for medieval Christians, Christians began to wonder if it would bring the end of the age, and these kinds of things being discussed in that passage. So there was definitely a lot of expectation at that time for something like the return of Christ or the rise of Antichrist or any of these kinds of things we usually associate with the end times. Now, we see this expectation from various sources. I just thought it would be fun to read some of these. At least I'm interested in it. But it also gives you examples of the kinds of things these kinds of people say and the kinds of events that spark these kinds of statements. So here's some examples. So first, we have a letter from the Bishop of Auxerre to the Bishop of Verdun, written in the late 900s, which speaks of widespread apocalyptic reactions among the population, specifically in the country of Hungary. So that's over in Eastern Europe. So you've got a nation of people that are just kind of on edge, expecting these very apocalyptic things to begin happening, there in the late 900s. In 964, and I will butcher this man's name, but I do want to cite my source, so we'll give it a try here. This guy's name is Carlulaire de Saint-Jean de Marnes. Obviously, he is French, okay? But in the year 964, he writes this, quote, "As the century passes, the end of the world approaches," end quote. Very blunt. He speaks his mind pretty plainly there as to what he thinks is going to happen as the year 1000 draws near. In 968, there was an eclipse, and anytime something happens in the skies, people usually freak out, and it was certainly the case here. An eclipse greatly worried specifically this army of soldiers under King Otto I of Germany. They all thought it was the sign of the end. I don't know, you want a bunch of guys with their weapons going crazy thinking the end is near when they see an eclipse. Kind of a dangerous situation for all around. But this army of guys was freaking out when they saw that eclipse in the year 968. A little later, the year 989, there was a visit from what we now call Halley's Comet, right? They didn't know back then it was just this comet that regularly comes around every so often. They just saw a comet, and like most people did in that time, freaked out when they see a comet. They had much the same response as those soldiers did. Seeing this comet was surely a sign of the end. After all, the year 1000 is approaching. Why not? And then another example, the year 990. A guy named Alfric, who was the abbot of Eynsham, England, so we're going up to England now. He delivered numerous sermons filled with apocalyptic imagery, references to the Last Judgment, and the unleashing of the Antichrist, and again pointing to the year 1000 as the time when these things were going to start happening. So here's a guy standing in the pulpit very much like I'm doing right now, just telling people the world's going to end in the year 1000 and just making that a huge theme of his ministry as that time drew near. Here's another example. Abbot of Fleury, a French abbot, who died in the year 1054. So now we're kind of looking back on this time, in a sense. He wrote this, and I guess in his book called his apologetic work, but he writes this about that time. He says this: "When I was a young man, I heard a sermon about the end of the world preached before people in the cathedral of Paris. According to this, as soon as the number of 1,000 years was completed, the Antichrist would come, and the last judgment would follow in a brief time. I opposed this sermon with what force I could from the passages in the Gospels, the Apocalypse, which is the book of Revelation, and the book of Daniel." End quote. So here's a guy kind of looking back on his younger years, talking about the kinds of sermons he had to oppose during his ministry, trying to get people to calm down and not worry about this stuff as everyone was doing. Still later, the year 1100, we've moved kind of beyond the year 1000 at this point, but there was a group of Christians. I've spoken about these guys before. I've spoken about them in very positive terms. The Waldensians, they're kind of a group of dissenters from the normal established church, usually pretty solid in what they teach, but among their group, they were still kind of the mind that the end might be near, because they're still kind of close enough to that 1,000 mark that they're still kind of on edge about it. They actually included that in one of their teaching poems that they wrote called The Noble Lesson. You can actually look that up and read it to see the kinds of stuff they were teaching. And you can see that they do have these sort of apocalyptic expectations. All of this around the year 1000. And of course, the new millennium came and went. And there was no Antichrist, no return of Christ, no last judgment, none of these things. So despite all of the expectation, nothing really came of it. And that was the second big phase of church history where this kind of thing was very common. All right, the next great spike of end times prediction came during the Protestant Reformation, which started officially in the year 1517. This is at least when Martin Luther, nailed his set of theses to the church door. And there's definitely stuff leading up to that, but that's kind of the classical marker for when the Reformation begins, 1517. Now, of course, the Protestant Reformation was a time when Christians in Europe became very divided. Like, things that had been believed and taught for centuries were now being upended, and people didn't know what to believe anymore, and people are kind of switching sides on these theological camps that are forming. And there's all this sort of religious upheaval. Meanwhile, there's another big threat. At this time, there was this constant threat of invasion from the Ottoman Turks. So this is an empire that was, to the southeast of Europe. A lot of Christians at that time considered this the nation of the Antichrist, just because they were considered the big threat to Christianity. There was pretty much expected at any time they're going to invade us and just take over. So you've got all these religious disturbances. You've got this threat of invasion from this powerful empire. Pretty rough time to be alive overall. And of course, these kinds of times very often lead to people expecting the end of the world and the return of Christ and all these kinds of things. So during the Protestant Reformation, you have a lot of that. Here are some examples. I'm going to start with the Roman Catholics. They're not the only ones, but I'm going to start with them. So this is the funniest one. I don't know, it's hard to say on a list of foolishness, how foolish can you get? This, however, I don't know, among Roman Catholics, the marriage of Martin Luther in 1525 led to the belief that the Antichrist was at hand. And I just want you to know, you heard me correctly. The marriage of Martin Luther was the end of the world for the Roman Catholics in every respect. So here's the thing. Philip Schaff writes about this. He has his book, The History of the Christian Church, and he records this, and he says that the Roman Catholics had a tradition, apparently, that the Antichrist would be the son of an ex-monk and an ex-nun. All right, so a man that left the monastery and a woman that left the life of a nun. These two are going to have a kid, and that kid's going to be the Antichrist. That was this tradition that apparently they had. Well, Martin Luther, who had been a monk, married Katharina von Bora, who had been a nun. This was the woman he married, right? And so the Catholics heard this and said, oh no, we know where this is going. Their kid's going to be the Antichrist, and before long, Jesus is going to return and all this. So yeah, the son of Martin Luther was expected to be the Antichrist by the Roman Catholics. It's amazing to think that. It's humorous, yes, but imagine believing that back in that time. But you know what? they weren't the only ones. The Catholics weren't the only ones with these kind of apocalyptic notions during the Protestant Reformation. There were a very different set of ideas held by the Anabaptists, another group that was very prevalent during the Protestant Reformation. These are the Christians who rejected the baptism of infants in favor of baptizing only believers. So these are the ones that were moving away from infant baptism. Beyond that, among the Anabaptists, practically anything goes. The different Anabaptist groups were all very different from each other, some of them very solid. I think a lot of us would even view them as sort of predecessors to what we're doing today. Others are just like over the edge crazy. It's just kind of a mixed bag with the Anabaptists. And some of those groups held very apocalyptic types of beliefs. There was an Anabaptist named Melchior Hoffman who taught, here we go, who taught that the city of Strasbourg in Germany was the New Jerusalem and that Christ would make his return there in 1533. So there you've got a set date, 1533, Jesus is going to come back to Strasbourg, Germany, which is now the New Jerusalem, apparently. And of course, that did not happen. You know, in case you're wondering, Jesus didn't return to Strasbourg, Germany in 1533. When that didn't happen, some other Anabaptists, not to be deterred, did the same kind of thing, basically. Led by a guy named Bernard Rothman, decided that the city of Munster, Germany, was actually the New Jerusalem. Germany was the big place to be, I guess, for the Anabaptists. So Munster, Germany, that's the New Jerusalem, and Christ would return there in 1534, the very next year. We're going to try it again for the next year. You know, the first one didn't work out, so let's just try again. And for this reason, the Anabaptists actually took over the city by violence. So this actually led to military action. They actually took over the city, and to make a long story short, they were all eventually killed, and Christ did not return. So this is definitely a more violent form of this kind of end times expectation. But again, you know, very specific year. They thought this was going to happen. It didn't happen, and ended very badly for them. So all of that among the Catholics, the Anabaptists. What about the mainstream Protestant types? You know, the people in the Protestant groups of Christianity that were forming at this time. What about them? Well, they had some other versions of this kind of thing where they're also expecting the end to come very near. So there are definitely some examples here. There was a Lutheran named Michael Stiefel who predicted the end of the age for 1533. And he lost his position as a minister for that. The other Lutherans said, hey, you know, we shouldn't be doing that kind of thing, so you're out. So fortunately, there was some kind of accountability there, but nonetheless, there was a Lutheran minister who set a date for the end of the age. Much later, in 1584, there was another Lutheran named Adam Knockenmoser, predicted 1635 as the most likely date for Christ to return. So he was reaching a bit further out in history from his time, but he still set a date, which again proved to be wrong. Finally, one of the founders of English Presbyterianism, a guy named Thomas Brightman, he set a date for Christ's return, the year 1695, again reaching out kind of far. But you see a lot of date setting here, even among these groups that become, you know, kind of the mainline Protestant denominations. Even among them, there was a lot of this stuff. So having reviewed all that, I think it's fair to say that the religious upsets of the Protestant Reformation and the continual threat of Turkish invasion, which was definitely on everyone's mind, all of that really played on the nerves of Christians and created all these end times expectations to where they're saying and doing some crazy stuff during the Protestant Reformation. It was that kind of time to live, and this kind of date setting was very common at that time because of all the craziness of that time. So there is your third major phase of history in the church where this sort of thing was happening. All right, let's go on now to the fourth phase here, not so far later on down the road. This is during the time of the Restoration movement, another set of failed predictions for the return of Christ and the end of the age and these kinds of things. So this is the 1800s, basically. So we're only a few centuries later on from the Reformation. Now, during that time in history, kind of another weird religious twist comes along among Christians. At this time, a good number of Christians, specifically in Britain and in America, came under the impression that true Christianity no longer existed. All the different denominations and traditions of Christianity were just corrupt, hopelessly corrupt, and it was time to start over, time to start fresh, time to restore true Christianity to the earth. That's where the Restoration movement gets its name. The result was the creation of many new religious movements, all trying to do that, all trying to restore Christianity to what it ought to be, according to the way they thought of it. Many of these groups also had a flair for preaching the imminent return of Christ. So there's a lot of date setting going on among these groups as well. So I wanted to give you some examples of all this. Again, they're kind of all over the place. But the first example is a Scottish preacher named Edward Irving. He founded a group called the Catholic Apostolic Church. So Catholic Apostolic Church. And he wrote a book, and I'm going to read you the title of his book. Now, book titles were pretty long back then. So here is the title of his book: The Last Days, a Discourse on the Evil Character of These Our Times, Proving Them to be the Perilous Times and the Last Days. That's the title of his book. So if you're wondering what the book is about, it's about the last days and a discourse on the evil character of these our times, proving them to be the perilous times and the last days. That's what his book is about. So that's what he's talking about, and he argued in that book, from calculations made from the book of Daniel, that the generation, here it's very specifically worded, so I'm going to try to get this right. The generation alive in 1823 would not die until they saw the end of the age. So whatever's going into that, he worded it very specifically. So 1823, if you're alive in that year, you're not going to die until you see the end of the age. That was his prediction. Wrong again. Okay, so too bad for Edward Irving. Moving on to another guy, you've probably heard this guy's name, Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon movement, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the other offshoots of his teachings. Another very well-known example happening there in the Restoration movement of the 1800s also has some examples of date setting. In 1843, he said this, quote, "There are those of the rising generation who shall not taste death till Christ comes," end quote. All right, so he thought that the generation alive in his time, the rising generation of his time, he thought that they were going to see Christ return. And of course, that didn't happen either. One of the many false prophecies of that particular false prophet. Another example, this one a little bit more mundane perhaps, but this man is a Baptist preacher named William Miller. All right, so this man gave rise to what is known as the Millerite movement. So within the Restoration movement, you have another one of these movements of trying to restore things to the way they ought to be among Christians. So he very much was promoting this kind of nationwide expectation. This was a pretty big thing in the United States for the return of Christ. One of his big points was that Christ was coming soon. Now, much like Edward Irving, William Miller made calculations from the book of Daniel. His calculations were a little bit different, though. He calculated that Christ would return in 1844. So again, very specific date made by calculations from the book of Daniel. As the months went by in 1844, Miller actually kept moving the specific date of the return later and later in the year because it wasn't happening. So he's kind of kicking it back throughout all of 1844 until the entire year passed and Christ did not return. So pretty much failed on that one. But even though it was obviously incorrect, there were at that time many Millerites, if you want to use the term, who then reinterpreted those teachings as referring to some kind of heavenly event that happened in 1844. So the date itself matters. Something did happen. It just happened in heaven where no one could view it. And they've kind of kept on doing what they were doing. And this, by the way, was eventually taken up into the beliefs of the Seventh-day Adventists. So if you ever see them or hear from them, this is still one of their things, that 1844 was the date of some specific heavenly event. And it matters even though we didn't witness it and don't know what it was per se. So that's another common trick among the date setters. Whenever they get proven wrong, they just kind of reinterpret things to mean something different. Speaking of which, we have the Jehovah's Witnesses, the next example on this list. Another group that started back in the 1800s, the late 1800s, still exists today. You can still see Jehovah's Witnesses going door to door and teaching stuff. Now, on the one hand, I don't think any group has embraced date setting with such a fervor as the Jehovah's Witnesses. They have done a lot of this from almost the time they were conceived as a group to the present day. They do a lot of date setting. On the other hand, it's hard to say anything definite about their predictions because they keep changing them. Like, you get to reading about any one prediction they made, and you've got to read like a dozen alterations that they made to the prediction as time went on. It is absolutely frustrating to research. But the Jehovah's Witnesses have always claimed that their predictions came from a study of the Bible. They have always tried to go into the Bible and again make their calculations from numbers in the Bible and try to say that there's biblical support for the things they're saying. But they would also feel the liberty to change their predictions based on new studies, whether that meant changing them ahead of time before the date actually arrives, or changing them after the apparent failure of their prediction. So basically, it's a way to not be proven wrong, even though they get proven wrong by events not turning out the way they predicted. They did a lot of that kind of stuff, and they're still doing those kinds of things up till the present day. So all of that I just said, all of that comes out of the Restoration movement back during the 1800s, mostly in the United States and in Britain. You can see that this phase was very similar to the Protestant Reformation, in that you've got these kinds of religious upsets. People are going around saying, oh, the true church doesn't exist anymore. We need to get back to real Christianity. And people are just making up all this stuff, and included with that is, the return of Christ and it being soon. All of that was going on back in the 1800s. It's the fourth major phase for this kind of thing in church history. Now, all that brings us up to more recent events. So this is the final phase I want to cover as my example of just Christians trying to predict the return of Christ. I've called this period the present insanity probably because I live in it and it just seems insane to me, but maybe it was no worse than any of these prior periods of time. Nonetheless, that's what I call it, the present insanity. Now, as the name implies, this phase continues to the present day when Christians commonly believe that they can predict the return of Christ. It's almost become a feature of Christianity now to see this, which is really sad and really unfortunate, given what Jesus has taught us about no man knowing the day or the hour. We all think we can know the day and the hour, and we just keep trying anyway. It's very unfortunate. Nonetheless, it is true. Now, I suspect that things like the invention of nuclear bombs and the fears of the Cold War put everybody in the right mindset to expect the end of the age. Several decades ago, that very much was the status quo. I mean, we could enter nuclear winter at any moment. One of the world leaders flips that switch and it's all over from there. I mean, that kind of mindset very much lends itself to an apocalyptic feeling. And since that time, we've not really gotten over it. I mean, the world is still kind of a tumultuous place. The Cold War may be over to some degree, but there's all kinds of stuff upsetting the world. And so we're still kind of in that mindset of expecting the end. And so we keep going with our end times predictions. To begin, I'll return to the Jehovah's Witnesses. As I said, they have always been doing this kind of stuff, and they've kept doing it. Starting in 1966, the leaders of the Jehovah's Witnesses started pushing the idea that Christ would return in 1975. That was their newest prediction as of that point. And they believed it so much that some of these guys were actually selling their homes to dedicate themselves to full-time preaching. It's like, well, if Jesus is coming back, I don't need my house. So they sell their house and they use the money to kind of fund a ministry where they're trying to alert people that Jesus is going to come back in 1975, which did not happen, again, despite not learning from all their past mistakes. But that kind of thing was happening and has been a feature of Christianity. Now, the real beginning, if you want to, I call this the real beginning because it's a little more rooted in more biblical forms of Christianity, so a little bit closer to home for us. The real beginning of this present insanity, as I have called it, comes in 1970 with the work of a man named Hal Lindsey. Now, I mention him by name because he's had a pretty big effect on how Christians handle this kind of stuff. If you ever hear of a group of people called prophecy scholars, if you ever hear that phrase thrown around, they're all basically copies of one original, and that original is Hal Lindsey. He was kind of the first guy to make prophecy scholarship kind of its own thing. So he pretty much sets the trend for how this stuff works. Now, the first of his several books was a book called The Late Great Planet Earth. Again, this is kind of dated. This is all back in the 70s, but perhaps recent enough that maybe you've heard this book title. In this book, Lindsey puts forth the idea that Christ would return before 1990. So he was kind of soft in his date setting in that he didn't, give a precise date, but he did say before 1990. And he developed this idea from studying the Bible and from looking at world events. And the kinds of things he argues, both from the Bible and in pointing at world events, is the same kind of stuff you'll still hear today. Anytime you hear someone doing this kind of thing, giving a date or kind of a end point for when Christ is likely to return, it's all very similar to what Hal Lindsey was doing. Now, of course, Hal Lindsey, he kept that going for as long as he could. Eventually, he had to change his interpretation of things to say that the end times would really get going by the year 2000, right? And this is where we get to, those of us who were alive and aware at that time know that at around the year 2000, there was quite a lot of expectation for the return of Christ. Well, Hal Lindsey was driving a lot of that by his kind of renewed interpretations that he came out with. And he put those out in the book Planet Earth 2000 AD, his revision of his prior beliefs. But of course, that failed too. I mean, he just kept rolling back the date, and nothing ever came of any of that. But he's a pretty big name in this list of people that do this kind of date setting. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of people copy Hal Lindsey. He's kind of the trendsetter. But if you're looking for perseverance among these guys, the people who just do not give up, they set a date, and then another one, and another one, and another one. If you're looking for perseverance, no one has outdone a guy named Edgar C. Whisenant, okay? So there's a guy who really tried as hard as he could. He tried this 4 times, okay? 4 different times in his life he set a date. And I have to admit, his first book has the best title I've ever heard, okay? Here you go. Here's his book title. 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Be in 1988. He's got it. That's the best title for a book I've ever heard in my life. It's like, and the problem is, it didn't happen. 1988 came and went. Nothing happened, right? So he decided to try again, 1989, the very next year. It's like, well, maybe it'll be this year. And then he tried 1993, and then he tried 1994. And after that, he finally gave up. But 4 tries. If at first you don't succeed, try, and try again. He did it, right? He really kept going. Now that 1994 prediction, that's a good segue into another one, another prophecy scholar. This guy made waves a little more recently, so maybe you remember this guy's name, Harold Camping. I don't know if that name rings a bell with you all, but his work has been a bit more recent. Now this guy is another kind of repeat offender, if you want to call that. He's tried several times to predict the return of Christ. His first guess was made for 1994, very much like Whisenant, but that didn't pan out, of course. That was just kind of a warm-up for Harold Camping. He really caused a stir by predicting that the world would end on October 21st, 2011, just over 10 years ago, so not too long ago. Maybe you remember some of this happening, but think about that date, October 21st, 2011. He's like really putting the finger on the calendar for this one. I mean, he really tried to narrow it down to a specific date, more so than a lot of these guys will do. Now, I remember pretty clearly all the stir that caused and all the disappointment when nothing happened. I mean, there was a lot of people very upset on that day. I can remember reading about it and just being like, oh, what is going on here? But Harold Camping's method was, of course, a familiar one, basically using numbers and dates from the Bible, trying to calculate an expiration date for the world, basically. And I remember reading his argument, and if you read one of those guys' arguments, you read them all. They're all pretty similar. They just take all these dates that seem to have significance and just kind of go through all the numbers and patch them all together. It's a mess, but people believed it. It just didn't pan out that way. Just a big failure. Now, since Herald camping, I know of only one man who has tried to set a date. And this guy, I don't think he made much of a stir, but I did read about this guy, so I figured I would include him in my list here. So this guy calls himself a Christian numerologist. So a numerologist is someone who not only studies numbers, but tries to use them to predict things. It's usually more like fortune-telling type stuff. So anyway, Christian numerologist, definitely a contradiction in terms, and not a pure Christian method if you want my opinion on it. But this guy's name is David Mead. Now, he tried and failed twice to predict the end of the age. And here we have more specific dates. So his first guess, September 23rd, 2017. Not long ago, just a few years ago, really, overall. Now, he arrived at his conclusion, and this is a real game changer here. So he arrived at his conclusion not only from biblical passages, but also from astrology, right? So now he's mixing in astrology stuff, trying to do this. Trying to predict the future from the stars. That's basically what astrology is. And also, by the way, the theory that our solar system has another planet called Nibiru. So he's throwing in all kinds of stuff here. So we have this other planet out there that we don't know about yet called Nibiru, and that's somehow important for calculating when Jesus is going to return. It's like, wow, okay. But September 23rd, 2017, nothing happened. So he tries again. April 23rd, 2018. So moved it back a few months, right? Move it down the road here. And this one was based on the fact that the sun, moon, and Jupiter would all be in the constellation of Virgo on that day, which he views as the fulfillment of Revelation 12, verses 1 through 2. The sign that he sees of the Virgin and the sun and the moon and the stars, he thought all of that was referring to astrological stuff. So he calculated April 23rd, 2018. Nothing happened again. But there you go, David Mead. So the most recent example that I found for this kind of thing. Now, before I end this, I have to mention some other kind of more common recurring examples. Just to get this off my chest, because I've had a problem with this for a long time. I cannot fail to mention what was at least very common in the past around presidential elections. All right? So in the past, I'm thankful to say I haven't really heard this lately. Maybe I've just been living under a rock or something, but it seems like maybe we've gotten away from this. But in the past, it was very common for Christian right-wingers to claim that the Democrat presidential candidate was the Antichrist. Just like election after election after election, that was the argument. So-and-so is the Antichrist, therefore don't vote for him. It's like, well, if he's the Antichrist, isn't it inevitable that he's going to get in power? Anyway, it doesn't even make sense as an argument. Nonetheless, this was very common. I can remember hearing these kinds of arguments made about Bill Clinton, Al Gore, John Kerry, and especially Barack Obama. For some reason, that guy especially got the heat for being the Antichrist. But again, all these guys came and went, right? Two of them didn't even get elected. It just didn't even come to anything. Anyway, like I said, it seems like it's not as common now, but it used to be pretty common, and I just hope we never get back to that. But it is kind of the same thing, right? After all, if this guy is going to become president, and if he's the Antichrist, doesn't that mean Christ is going to follow soon after? That is a kind of soft date setting, right? So not as precise as saying September 23rd, 2017, but it's still kind of setting a timeline for when the end of the age is going to happen. Now, all of my examples so far have been either from specific persons who are trying to set these dates or assertion made about specific persons, one way or another. But I cannot fail to mention just the general mindset that has plagued Christians for the past several decades, just kind of the general feel that we have for this kind of end-time stuff. All of this business of predicting the return of Christ or other events related to the end of the age has trained us to always expect the end when some kind of crisis occurs. It has become, again, kind of a feature of Christianity. We have just been trained to act that way. When I was in high school, any flare-up in tension in the Middle East would always result in pastors, youth pastors, and kids at school going bonkers because, of course, the end was near, right? If somebody fires a gun in the Middle East, that means Jesus is coming back, right? And they kept thinking that year after year. Nothing ever came of it, but that was nonetheless the mindset. Wars, earthquakes, treaties, new diseases, All these things allegedly prove to us that Christ will return soon. It's just a very common mindset we have. And every time Christians get these silly ideas, and every time we're disappointed. Every time it just doesn't turn out to where Christ returns. We're always wrong about this. Meanwhile, unbelievers mock us for this, and people with weak faith will actually abandon Christ because, hey, their pastor told them Jesus was about to return, and he didn't come back. It's like this causes a lot of destruction. It causes people outside of the kingdom to really mock us. It causes people who are among Christians to just leave Christianity because these expectations don't pan out. And all that to say, we cannot mature as Christians, nor as the church at large. We cannot mature at all while holding to such silly ideas which have been disproved again and again and again throughout history, not only in recent decades, but in past eras of the church's history. I mean, after this sermon today, even if it was tedious to sit here and name all these things, look at the amount of times that we've tried and failed to predict anything regarding the end times. It just doesn't pan out. It's like we're not going to mature as Christians until we get away from this kind of wrong-headed idea that is always trying to predict when Jesus is going to return. So really this brings us all back to the passage I read at the very beginning. No man can know the day or the hour of Christ's return. Even those that have tried really hard, tried and tried again. They've not been able to do it. There's just no way to do it. What Jesus said in the Olivet Discourse is exactly right. You just can't know when God is going to do these things. There's no way. All right. Well, knowing what we know about date setting, I can now make some kind of final application here. We can see that it always results, or at least most often results, from kind of a combination of ingredients. On the one hand is hard times. Like anytime life gets a little bit difficult, the world gets a little bit upset, something just goes terribly wrong, those kinds of times are very prone to people date setting, to trying to set a time frame for when Jesus is going to return. The second ingredient is this really weird misuse of biblical numbers and other frames of time that you can find in the Bible. Usually it's the book of Daniel. I think one of the common themes among these date setters is they're always going to the book of Daniel. Daniel does give a lot of year counts and day counts and things like that. And for some reason people are drawn to that. They always want to use that kind of stuff, not just in Daniel but in other parts of the Bible. They always want to use that as some kind of formula for predicting the end. So basically that's the overall result here. So for the future, I can tell you this for certain. I am no prophet, but I can tell you this. If we come to another kind of hard time in history, I guarantee you somebody's going to take out their calculator, open the Bible, and start calculating another date for when Jesus is going to return. It's going to happen. Be ready for that. I have given you every reason to just ignore those people from the outset. No one has ever gotten it right. It is time to start ignoring them. Don't encourage them by paying attention to them. Just pretend they don't exist and hope they go away. We should laugh at these people for their foolishness, but we should also take warning. We should also take warning not to fall into those kinds of traps just because the world around us is getting hard and somebody comes out with what seems like a convincing argument. People do believe them because they seem convincing, but we got to remember the past here. Don't let this fall out of your memory. Keep it in mind and remember. So again, just to review the 5 kind of heydays of date setting, just to give you a summary of these things. We talked about the persecution of Emperor Septimius Severus, kind of the first example of Christians having this kind of expectation. Then the First New Millennium, around the year 1000. There was another trend of date setting at that time. Then the time of the Protestant Reformation, when so much of the world was kind of unsettled. And then the Restoration movement back in the 1800s, especially in America and Britain. And then finally, the present insanity today, all these different date setters we've seen in recent decades. So all of that, again, just to illustrate the point that Jesus is trying to make, no one can know the day or the hour. Now, as for the passage itself, as I said, in my next sermon, I will teach on the actual passage. We'll try to dissect what Jesus is saying there, try to get some detail, and come to a better understanding of what he's trying to convey to his disciples in that passage. So that's all I have to say today. If there are questions or comments, we can hear those and see what we need to do.